Hello, today I want to be doing a video on the Indian Army and why it's probably one of the most underrated top dogs there probably is. Um, the Indian Army is a pretty modern force. It's got a pretty significant army. I think it's somewhere around 3 million people. I think they have somewhere around 1 million active personnel and at least 2 million in the reserve. The Indian Army is trained and modeled after the British Army, and it's the inheritor of the British Army of India. So it's had a pretty long and storied military tradition, and it's proven itself to be a pretty capable fighting force in both the 20th and 21st centuries. The Indian Army currently operates a variety of domestically produced but internationally sourced weaponry. And Indian arms manufacturers are actually pretty capable of producing, sustaining, and fielding domestically built weaponry. Most stuff India operates and most stuff you see the Indian Army using is made in India and is held to a pretty decent standard. Especially like you could easily compare it with things made in China or the European Union. The history of the Indian Army, the modern Indian Army, was established by the British in 1895. The Indian Army was largely equipped with British weapons, trained by British officials, and taught to fight alongside the British admirably. The Indian soldiers have since then played a crucial role in almost all British conflicts. India was for the longest time considered by Britain to be its most prized possession. And that has to do with a variety of things, like the production of natural resources, things like tea. India was really able to mass produce a lot of the stuff that the British needed at the time. India's independence, so the partition of India, uh, Pakistan, the divide between the armies of India and Pakistan, Indian army under Indian control, conflict with Pakistan, and a conflict with China. So during the partition of India, the Indian and the Pakistan or the army of India was split between Pakistan and India. I believe India inherited about 260,000 trained personnel from the British, and the Pakistanis inherited about 160,000 personnel, uh, trained personnel from the British. This was largely based on the division of the regiments of the British Army of India. A couple of their regiments were based in Pakistan, so therefore Pakistan inherited those. And the majority of them were located in India, which is why India inherited those. So the Indian Army under Indian control, eventually, obviously, the Indian Army had to go through a process of unification. That means the British Army of India was largely led and funded by the British, pretty much, and it had a lot of British officers. So the Indian Army under Indian control, the Indians went through a process of phasing out British commanders and British leaders and officers, and replacing them with Indian ones. And the English Army, for a long time, like well until the 1950s, I think was still helping the Indian armed forces in a variety of ways, using a variety of officers and using English know-how. This is, for instance, one of the reasons why India's current navy is actually really good. And this is also one of the reasons why, even though in the West people like to make jokes about India, their military equipment and their know-how of how to use it is actually remarkably good. India has also had a conflict with Pakistan over its borders, and a conflict with China over its borders, which means India has never really lacked for any actual recent military expertise or experience. So the modern Indian Army, after India gained its independence in the 1950s, it was coupled with Indianization of the Indian Army under supervision of the English. Today, India's army is actually the largest volunteer force in the world. Now, what that means is India does not use conscription. Matter of fact, India has pretty high standards for its soldiery. Like the fact that the Indian government and the upper management make their soldiers do stuff that we think looks stupid. Um, the reason why they do it is simply because they can. There's very few other countries in the world that can make their soldiers do um, really stupid stunts with such discipline. You really have to think about that. Like having the largest volunteer force in the world, that says something because I think China's conscription based. Um, so is the United States, and to a large extent, a lot of European armies. Whereas the modern Indian army is 100% a volunteer force. Um, like I don't even think they have a mechanism for conscription, just because it will probably never be necessary for them due to having such a huge manpower pool reserve to draw upon. Um, India's army is a formidable ground power with modern weaponry. So India's got tanks, missiles, anti-air systems, airplanes, helicopters, ground vehicles, artillery. India's really got it all. It doesn't lack for military capabilities or weaponry. It's pretty much same as most modern militaries. It's got all the stuff. The only reason why the Indian Army is supposedly ranked low is because they import some of their military technology. However, India has always insisted on domestic manufacture of these military goods. So, the Indian Army, for instance, uses a AK-47 derivative. However, they made a deal with the Russians that they would buy a certain patent for a specific type of AK-47, which would then be produced in China, or sorry, in India. And um, India has a lot of manufacturing sites where they actually produce all their weaponry domestically. Meaning, if you see an Indian wielding an AK, it's probably not a Russian AK. It's definitely Russian design, but it's an Indian-made AK. The rifle would be Indian, the bullets in it would be Indian, the magazine would probably be Indian, and most importantly, the guy wielding it will probably also be an Indian more than likely. The Indian Army has an excellent officer corps and a good NCO corps. Now, this is partially due to the Indian Army largely being set up by the British. So they have an excellent system where they have a cadre of higher ups who have a bunch of non commissioned officers and commissioned officers who provide the training for the regular soldiery. Um, and Indian soldiers actually, their training standards equal almost any NATO force. Maybe not some extremely good NATO forces like, let's say, the United States, England, or France, or Germany, but like the Indians have an equally high standards as do the Poles or the Romanians or the Italians or the Spanish. Which is funny because the Spanish have a lot of weird military uniforms and gayness going on. And even though the Indians are doing kind of silly stunts, it's at least they're not gay. India's demography and economy. So India currently has the largest population, and large population almost always equals large army. Um, Large population also means a lot of economic growth, and because India's demography is largely a lot of their population pyramid is very stable. So you have a lot of young people. Let's say almost every family is like at least 3 to 4 kids. So you have like for each child you have two grandparents, but you have 4 kids. So there's no problems with replacement. Also, simply because they have so many people, it means India pretty much is predicted to be growing for at least the next 100 years. Like their population will be growing continually. And their population growing also means their economy growing, which also means their army growing, and also India making more of their own stuff and better stuff. Um, which goes without say if you understand anything about how economics work. India's economy is also one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in the world. A lot of people like to give that credit to the United States or China, but China has had a lot of problems with its own demography and also economic collapse, kind of, because China is very reliant on other nations for their economic well-being, whereas India is a lot more reliant upon itself, which is why India's economy is pretty stable in terms of growth, and why India is also sort of historically in the modern day always had an India first policy, because they care about growing their economy and their population and taking care of their people, unlike some other states currently. Indian made. So again, India has largely tried to be independent in terms of manufacturing. Think of companies like Tata Steel and Mahindra and Mahindra. Um, they're known car manufacturers, but they also produce vehicles for the Indian Army. Besides regular ground vehicles, they also produce things like APCs and tanks. Um, Obviously under license, but still they're Indian made. Same with the things like ammunitions and command and control systems, aerial reconnaissance systems, UAVs, drones. India's got all the jazz, man. Um, Again, it's Indian made stuff, so it's still a little bit funny to us, but it works. Like you can make fun of Indian stuff working all you want, but it's still gonna work. And if you're a modern day power, you should be very wary of having a nation as like India as an adversary. They have a huge population, and trust me, in the future, their navy is probably going to be growing and far surpass that of either the United States or China. India made numerous deals with weapon producers to make weapons in India. We already talked about this. India really likes doing this. So when India finds a weapon system or some form of military capability that they can't manufacture in house because it's too hard, they'll just buy licenses. I think they bought licenses from places like Israel, which has pretty advanced weaponry available, licenses from places like Russia. And they, more importantly, have started to switch over more and more to indigenous Indian equipment. And indigenous Indian equipment is actually of a pretty high standard. Think companies like Tata Steel and Mahindra. Um, like Tata Steel is a known steel company, like pretty famous globally as well, and they know what they're doing. Like, don't get any ideas about it. Indian steel is the same essentially as any European or American made steel. Indian bullets will hurt just the same as American bullets will hurt. And the Indians are becoming better and better each year at making their own bullets. And they have no lack of regional rivals, think China and Pakistan. So they have all the reason they could ever need to keep making bullets and make them better and better and better. The same goes for things like artillery shells and ship munitions. So the Indian Navy is currently already actually a pretty advanced blue water navy that would make China blush. They're capable of conducting long range military combat operations really far from India's homeland. It's currently got two operational aircraft carriers that are modern and capable of long range operation far from Indian territory. So, India is one of the few nations in the world to actually field their own aircraft carriers, and aircraft carriers are pretty much the technological, I'm a global political player power tool, because most aircraft carriers have similar air capabilities or stronger capabilities, I would even argue, than most other countries do. And India has two of them. India also has a variety of modern ships that can fulfill a variety of roles. I think India actually is in the works of completing its own indigenous version of a carrier battle group. Um, and that means that the Indians will have at least one fleet that, in terms of capabilities, is equal to probably any United Nations or, United States or European Union carrier battle group force. And the Indians have the desire to actually, to do this, and they're really going for it. Like, do not think of Indian ship making as a slouch. They've had training from the British. The British still supply them with information, I think. I think India and England are still strategic partners. So a lot of people will think about Indian equipment as being like more like stereotypical Indian made equipment, but usually it's more like British designed or inspired equipment. It's just Indian built. And the Indians have been building English things for a long time. So if you think, let's say, Indian equipment or Indian-made equipment during World War II was bad, then think again, because England and the United States won World War II, also using a lot of Indian-made equipment, by the way. Um, India also has decided to make most systems in-house. So a lot of systems, if they can get away with producing it in-house, they're going to produce it in-house for their ships. They may get some technologies or use some technology transfers from other countries, like let's say the United Kingdom, the United States, Russia, maybe even some Dutch shipbuilding going on, or even some Korean. But usually they don't really order whole navies from other countries. What they do is they buy certain systems, then they transfer them over to the Indian Navy and get taught on how to use and operate those systems. Then probably some form of an engine manufacturer receives these systems, tests them themselves, see how they work, and then they take them apart and put them back together, and then probably do it again a couple more times until they have a good understanding of how the technology works, and then redevelops a similar system but in-house, and then produces it domestically. India has been a little bit reliant on Russian technology, but that is simply due to the fact that the Russian prices for all their military technology is simply so cheap, because the Russians inherited a huge stockpile of weaponry from the Soviet Union that the Russian Federation simply could not hope to maintain. So therefore, they started selling off a variety of assets of countries that uh, of military resources that they plundered from other countries. So, for instance, think places like Ukraine and Kazakhstan, very big countries that inherited a pretty decent amount of the Soviet military, but still the Soviet Union, or rather the Russian Federation, reclaimed most of that military equipment during the dissolution of the Soviet Union and just stored it to never end up using it, aside from maybe now. But they sold a lot of that stuff, and a lot of that stuff ended up in the hands of nations like India and the like, Pakistan, Turkey. And this Soviet equipment, there's nothing wrong with it. Like technologically, it's very sound, it's good, and it works. But it doesn't really hold a candle to modern American stuff, which is why you see kind of a shift away in India, and particularly in the Indian Navy, from using foreign systems sourced from places like Russia, to switching more to in-house designs. So India has actually got a nuclear arsenal. It's one of the few nations to actually have a nuclear arsenal. It is modest in comparison to nations like Russia and the United States, but it's because it doesn't really need to develop that many nuclear missiles, because it's got one of the strongest armies in the world to actually defend its territory pretty sufficiently. So India, I believe, possesses the nuclear triad, which means they have land-based missiles that they can launch from either missile silos or a missile launch system like the truck pictured right. They have nuclear submarines, which can strike even in the event of a first strike against India, where India would be completely nuclearly annihilated. And I also believe India possesses the capabilities to deliver nuclear weapons through the use of various airframes. Um, so India also possesses the ability to build and design nuclear weapons. India is not lacking for physicists or engineers with the know-how or interest in making nuclear weapons. It's just that India signed a non-nuclear proliferation treaty, and they have a huge army and navy. So for them, the necessity to build nuclear weapons to defend themselves kind of just doesn't exist. Also, in a way, India knows if, let's say, Pakistan, who also has nuclear weapons, would decide to lob nuclear weapons at India, number one, the Chinese won't like it. Number two, the Russians probably won't like it either. Number three, the American and the Western powers will definitely not like it. And Pakistan would be a global pariah for the rest of its history, which really only benefits India. So the need for both India and Pakistan to develop nuclear weapons has kind of decreased over the past decades, due to both of them having capable military forces that they can use for power projection and things like defending their border, which make nuclear weapons kind of unnecessary. Although the reason they do have them is because their adversaries have them, and any modern self-respecting power needs to develop some form of nuclear weapons or deterrence in order to be considered a modern and capable threat. India currently maintains a no first strike policy, which means India is pretty much pledged, like, we're never going to fire our nukes until someone fires them at them. That is generally the policy that most nations have regarding nuclear weapons. So the whole idea behind a nuke is you develop a nuke primarily based with the reason that your enemy has a nuke, so your enemy has the ability to strike first. So you develop nuclear weapons and adopt a no strike first policy. So you're saying, like, okay, my enemy has nukes, I have nukes. If you fire, we're going to fire, meaning nobody can fire, which is why, in my opinion, nuclear missiles are kind of useless, nonsensical dick measuring contest weapons for nations, because they can go, oh, look, I have them. Look at my missile PP. And it's just so not interesting. I prefer regular, actual military capabilities over these kind of fancy doomsday weapons, because they really don't bring anything to the table. In closing, so India's armed forces are a capable military force. India's navy is capable of conducting long-range military operations. The Indian armed forces have had a long military tradition and proved themselves a capable fighting force. For any nations that require a good partner in terms of 21st century security only needs to look at India to see a good trade partner, a security ally, and above all, a wonderful country with a hectic and interesting history. Again, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Personal message for the Indian president, whoever it is. It's Modi at the time of recording. Please ban Indian scam call centers. Thank you on behalf of all of humanity. Congratulations on beating PewDiePie T-Series. You won. You won the YouTube. You're the biggest now. Also, if you enjoy these topics, please join the Discord. And above all, have a nice day. All right. This has been my video on why the Indian army is kind of considered a global underdog. Bye-bye.